And he said, I never forget his words. He said, Mum, throughout our many lives, our souls need to experience all there is to experience. And it's only when our souls are strong enough that they can take on their biggest challenge. This is my biggest challenge. I'm not coming back.
And it's like, I'm dealing with your tumor, I'm dealing with your frozen shoulder, I'm dealing with this. And nobody talks to each other. And when you say, is everything connected, anything connected, they look at you like you're just bloody mad.
I said, you've got 60 people out there who this could help. I said, my son's, this is not just him that this helps. And he literally put his fingers in his ears and he said, and he looked away and he said, I toe the party line. I don't want to hear it. I toe the party line.
Welcome to The Wellness Way with me, Philly J. Lay, a layperson's guide to your natural health systems, your very own NHS.
Hello, lovely people, and welcome to another episode of The Wellness Way with Philly J. Lay. Please subscribe to this podcast, turn on your notifications and tell everybody you know so we can get the algorithms working in our favor, because we have such important information to get out here. And today I'm going to introduce to you a woman I absolutely adore. I first saw her on daytime TV, actually, this morning, 5 years ago, and I just listened to her story and I could not imagine what this woman had gone through. The amazing Callie Blackwell. She works holistically with plant medicines, nature, energy, and breath. Callie, welcome to The Wellness Way. So lovely to have you here.
Oh, thank you so much, Billy. I am so excited to be here, as you are just such an inspiration to me. And so to be on this podcast is actually such an honor. So I'm very grateful to that you invited me on here. So thank you so very much.
Oh, I'm blushing now. I'm not inspirational. I'm just a mad woman on a mission.
Me too. Me too.
Absolutely. Right. I'd like you to start by telling our audience your story and the story of your son, Darren. And you are the author of A Boy in 7 Billion. There's the book. Fantastic. And this is one of the most heart-wrenching stories I had ever heard. And I don't know as a mother how you get through that, but I know how you got through it. And I want to unfold this from the beginning. So tell us how this started for you.
Wow. So yeah, it was in 2010 that my eldest son then, who was 10 years old, Darren, he was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. And of course, that turned my world upside down. And very quickly, I learned that my child wasn't mine when they told me that he would be made a ward of the court and taken into care if I didn't allow chemotherapy. And at that time, I didn't have the confidence or the knowledge or the wherewithal or anything to go and do anything else with him. So of course, I followed the guidelines and I went down the path. And then 2 years later, whilst on active chemotherapy, he was diagnosed with a second cancer called Langerhans cell sarcoma. Now, there was only 50 cases of that since records began, and there were only 5 people in the entire world that had Langerhans cell sarcoma at that time. And he was the only one to have it as a secondary cancer, and he was the youngest. So he was the only person in the entire world that they didn't know what to do with him. And of course, we want our children to be unique, but this, not that unique.
Not unique,
not
yes.
That, when you've got a team of doctors saying, we have never seen this before, we don't know what to do. So they sent off slices of his tonsils all over the world. And it came back that both cancers had derived from his bone marrow. So they decided that a bone marrow transplant was the only way to go. Now, in March 2013, it's a long time ago now, but it's also not, March 2013, he had his first bone marrow transplant. And this followed on from, 3.5 years of chemotherapy, radiotherapy. He had 22 rounds of total body irradiation. Their words were, we don't know what to do with him, so we're going to give him everything we can without killing him. So he had adult doses of every single chemotherapy drug going. They were just throwing everything at him. He almost died from a number of infections before we even got to bone marrow transplant. It was just horrendous. bone marrow transplant happened from a donor in Germany, wonderful human being, and that one failed because he had a virus called adenovirus. And that virus that they were trying to treat was also killing off the new bone marrow. So it was kind of they went around in circles. So it failed his first one. So they gave him another one from the same donor. And sadly, he still had adenovirus. So that one failed also. So then they said to us, listen, thankfully, before he'd had all the radiation, they actually took some bone marrow from him, which they called a rescue dose. So that if they put it in a freezer, so that if all this went wrong, they'd have something to give him. Thank God. So they took that. So when his second one failed, they said, look, his graft versus host disease was absolutely horrendous. It was, his mouth all the way to his anus was just blistered. His skin was affected. His skin was literally, he was like a reptile, where his skin was just like, it was horrible. And so they said to us, look, the graft versus host disease is so horrendous right now. We're not going to bother with another transplant from the guy. Like, we're going to give him his own cells back. But the doctor said to me at that time, and this is where I first discovered nature, as the doctor said to me at this time, so we're going to give him his own cells back, but we're not going to treat the adenovirus anymore. And it takes 23 days for a bone marrow transplant to kick in, and we're not going to treat the adenovirus. So one is going to win. I suggest you pray. And I was like,
oh my God, I just can't imagine what that must have felt like.
It was horrible. And so I turned to the Google gods. And in fact, they had told me all the way up until this point, do not go on the internet. We will tell you everything you need to know. And I did. I listened to them. At this point, I was like, no, there has to be something else. So I Googled natural alternatives for adenovirus, which is a very simple virus that many of us will pick up and carry around and not even know. But when you have no immune system, obviously it's, it can be very detrimental. And so I found olive leaf extract, lemon balm, echinacea, manuka honey, olive leaf, vitamin C, all these things. And I was like, okay. So off I went down to the health food store and to this little apothecary across the road, and came back with all of this stuff. And within a week, I had his adenovirus gone. Within a week.
Oh my God. Oh, wow.
His virus count went from 3.2 million down to just under 1,000, kind of within that week to 10 days. Now, the worst thing was about this, and I don't usually tell this story when I do an interview, but it seems fitting right now, is that one of the doctors, the one that actually told me to pray, he's called Dr. Doom in my book. He came in and he said, I don't understand what's going on. And I said, what's happened? And he said, Darren's count has gone back up to 3.2 million overnight. And I said, how can that be? I said, can that be a mistake in the lab? Are you reading the wrong results? I said, because that seems very, very, that's a very definite number to go back down, up from 1,000 up to 3.2 million. And he said, no, there's no mistake. We don't make mistakes like that. There's absolutely no mistake.
And you never make mistakes in the medical profession.
Never make mistakes. No, absolutely not. And I said, well, what? I don't understand. And they said, well, we don't understand because by all intents and purposes, Darren doesn't look like he has a viral count of 3.2 million. And I said, no, I know he doesn't. So he said, well, that's what it is. And we're really sorry. We don't know what else to do. And then he turned and he looked at all of the other stuff I had on the end of the table. And he said, oh, what's all this? And I said, well, this is olive leaf extract. It does such and such. It blocks proteins and blah, 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 blah. And this is blah, blah, blah. And he looked at me and he went, well, it's not working, is it? And he just walked out the room.
Oh.
And I was left like, so that means my son's going to die, but you're okay with that because and there was a lot of those kinds of things that went on. Well, anyway, thankfully, another doctor came to my room that night at about 10:30 at night. And I was absolutely beside myself because I was like, well, I've tried I don't know what else to do. Now my son's going to die because the bone marrow transplant was still way off, And the doctor came to my door and he said, oh, I just wanted to let you know. He said, there was a mistake in the lab. He said, it's still under 1,000. And I said, well, thank you very much for putting me out of my misery. And then the Dr. Doom came back the next morning trying to give me the good news. And I said, don't worry, somebody's already put me out of my misery. It's not working. No, it's not working. And of course, he walked out the room again. So that's when I really discovered that nature had something going on. And So then sadly that third transplant did fail. They said that nobody had ever failed from their own cells. Well, he did. Somehow, we don't know how this happened, but somehow the T cells were Darren's and all of the other cells were the donors. The donors were supposed to be gone, but then he had 2 sets of DNA. They did chimerisms on him. It was crazy. They'd never seen anything like this before. So they then said, look, we're going to give him more chemotherapy to make sure there's absolutely nothing in his bone marrow, nothing there whatsoever. Darren wasn't best pleased about this. I'm not going to lie. He actually told me to just let him go. He didn't want any more chemotherapy. He didn't want to keep going through that, just to let him go.
How old was he at this point to actually say, let me go?
13.
13.
Yeah. And it was actually quite interesting. Just after his second transplant failed, I remember I was sat on the toilet and he was sat in the bath, and I was just talking to him and I said, dude, how are you not angry at the world? I was like, because he was diagnosed with autism, Tourette's syndrome and ADHD when he was 8 years old, and then cancer when he was 10, and then cancer again when he was 12, and he'd gone through all of this. And I said, there are a lot of people who are dealt a lot less cards than this, and they're angry at the world. I said, how do you not get angry? And he looked at me and he said, well, Mum, I chose this. And I said, okay, embellish for me as a 13-year-old boy, embellish. And he said, I never forget his words. He said, Mum, throughout our many lives, our souls need to experience all there is to experience. And it's only when our souls are strong enough that they can take on their biggest challenge. This is my biggest challenge. I'm not coming back. And it gives me goosebumps even now. And I looked at him and
I'm welling up.
And
holy crap.
He's an incredible human being, my boy. And I said to him, I went, well, I believe you. I absolutely believe you. And he said, well, I chose you, Mum, because you needed to learn some lessons. And he said, we all chose each other. He said, so how can I be mad? This is what I came here for. And I said, okay. So months and months later on, when his third transplant has failed and they want to give him chemo, and he's like, no, just let me go. And I said to him, do you know what, dude? I said, as much as you chose this, I said, you have to see this through to the natural bitter end. I said, because if you don't, what's going to happen? And he said, I'll have to come back and do this all over again. And I said, and do you want to do that? And he went, no. And I said, well, I also think you chose me because I won't let you give up. I'm not letting you give up. I said, if there was nothing else, then I would absolutely hold your hand and say, let's go. But there is one more chance. You have to take this. So he agreed. He had the chemotherapy and he had his fourth and final transplant. Thankfully, someone had split that bag into 2. So he had his fourth and final transplant in the October of 2013. And 3 days later, he trapped his fingers down the side of the hospital bed. And he picked up 2 catastrophic infections in his hand and he already had one in his mouth called Klebsiella, which is like MRSA on steroids. And so that ate a portion of his tongue. His hand just went black. Like, I have pictures on the internet. I haven't put them in my book because they're pretty gruesome, but I have pictures where his hand was just necrotic. Now, they wanted to amputate his hand. And I said, hang on a second, let's just have a look at some other things here. And he was already on morphine and fentanyl. He was on the highest dose he'd had ketamine, pethidine, you name it. I'd seen him pump with all of it. And so I started looking again. I turned back to the Google gods. Natural painkillers. What's a natural painkiller? Cannabis. Yep. Okay. Wonderful. And I was like, well, and I found this article. I found some things about a guy who'd been prescribed Bedrocan, which is a cannabis-based medicine that's available in Amsterdam and in Europe. And so I went to the oncologist and I said, listen, I found this other alternative that maybe we can try this before we cut his hand off. I just need a prescription. I'll drive over and get it. And she said, no, it's not licensed for children. Oh. Neither is chemotherapy. Neither is chemotherapy, by the way.
I didn't know that. Really? And yet yeah, they will take your child into care if you
do not poison them.
If you do not do it.